Greetings, APUSH scholars. This is our review for Unit 10, Populism and Progressivism, Reform Movements at the Turn of the 19th, 20th Century. As far as populism goes, looking at the review sheet here, complaints of the farmers is that basically threefold. They're being exploited by the railroads and by industrial monopolies and banks. And the railroads are charging them high freight rates, the banks are charging them high interest rates, and there's a lack of credit. The validity of their complaints, the AP has asked questions on the populace and sort of see both sides. The populace had valid complaints, that's for sure, but they were also victims of their own success. Their success as farmers led to overproduction, which drove the prices for corn and wheat down. The National Grange of the Patrons of Animal Husbandry, this is a predecessor group to the Populists, which is largely a farmers' political party, and the Grangers, or the Grange, these were farmers who were fighting high freight rates and grain storage prices. They wanted limits. Some of them wanted actual government takeover of the railroads and storage facilities. They organized cooperatives to buy industrial equipment at cheaper prices, and they organized various social and educational activities for the farmers. William Jennings Bryan was the candidate for two political parties in the election of 1896. He is both the Democratic Party's candidate and the Populist Party's candidate. It's called a fusion ticket. And his Cross of Gold speech is this speech in which he demands silver production. He demands coinage of silver for the purpose of inflation, for making more money available for farmers, for making it easier to pay off their debts. And he's got that famous speech. It goes something along the lines, well, one of the lines in the speech is, "You shall not press down on the brow of the working man a crown of thorns. You shall not crucify him on a cross of gold," referring to the gold standard. The largest support for populists was among Westerners, among Western farmers and Western states where they mined and produced a lot of silver. Similarity of Jackson to the Andrew Jackson, that is, to the populists, well, they both had it in for the banks. Remember Jackson vetoing the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. Some differences, though. Remember, the populists here, they want inflation, which is one of the reasons Jackson issued the Specie Circular, was to drive down inflation. And the populists wanted control, wanted limits on industry, such as railroads and Eastern producers of agricultural machinery. The crime of 1873 refers to taking silver out of circulation. For a while, there was what was called bimetallism, and that is the use of both silver and gold. Free silver is the slogan. It's the campaign slogan of the populists in 1896. The idea was to coin silver at the ratio of 16-1 to gold. And, of course, the populists do not win this election. William McKinley wins. And his argument against Bryan is that the silverites, that the farmers here are deluded, that they wanted to stabilize the economic system, that this is all sort of economic, just bad economics, and that factories will slow down, that they'll shut down, that workers will lose their jobs. And they're appealing to the recent memory of the Panic of 1893, arguably the worst American Depression in history up until this point, and that the farmers want to just sort of mess things up here by this sort of illusory idea that if you print more silver, everybody will be happy. In what ways was populism arguably conservative? Well, populism was opposed to change, was opposed to this new urban, this new industrial America. You can see them not as reformers, but you can see them as people want to sort of dial back the clock on change, where there just doesn't need to be so many farmers. These farmers are overproducing. They're being very successful, and there's this migration from the countryside to the cities, and that the populists are conservatives and that they want to maintain the status quo. They want to turn the clock back. They do not want this change, which is eroding their standard of living, their way of life, their very existence through the mechanization of agriculture. Progressivism, these are the heirs in many ways to the populists and other reform movements. The Pendleton Act of 1883, this is a civil service act which would have the hiring of government employees based upon merit rather than based upon the spoils system. And this is in wake of the assassination of President James Garfield. Ida Tarbell is a muckraker. She is one of these expose journalists who, in McClure's magazine, kind of a muckraking magazine, does a serial, which is a series of articles in the McClure's on the history of the Standard Oil Company, in which she exposes the how John D. Rockefeller would force railroads to give him rebates to drive his competitors out of business, and this idea of this unfair skullduggery of the Standard Oil Company and monopolizing the production and sale of oil in the U.S. Upton Sinclair, his famous book is The Jungle, and it's an expose of the filth and the disease in the Chicago meatpacking industry, the exploitation of, in particular, the protagonists are these Lithuanian immigrants. The goal here is to push socialism, but what he got out of it was Teddy Roosevelt, after reading the book, pushes for a Pure Food and Drug Act and the corresponding Pure and Food Drug Administration and a Meat Inspection Act. Upton Sinclair famously said something along the lines of he was aiming for the heart of the American people, for their brains, and he hit them in their stomach. Frank Norris wrote The Octopus, another muckraker you should know. He wrote a book about how the railroads would monopolize the freight rates here and total exploiting the farmers who had no choice. If they had a bumper harvest, the rates would go up when the farmers are expecting to make some more money. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. He is a photojournalist who did a expose on the slum tenements, the immigrants who lived in the ghettos in the large eastern seaboard cities. Teddy Roosevelt is known as a trust buster, and he brushed off the Sherman Antitrust Act, which I believe is 1890 vintage here, but previously it had only been used to break up labor unions, which were considered, ironically, monopolies. And he goes after Standard Oil, which is broken up by the courts, and this is John D. Rockefeller's monopoly. And then he goes after Northern Securities, which is a railroad monopoly in the West, which is basically led by J.P. Morgan, and this one also gets broken up. So Teddy Roosevelt becomes the champion of the little guy who says that monopolies are running the country. And he also, in the anthracite coal strike, takes the side of the workers. He threatens to send the military into the mines to run them. There's a shortage of coal as winter is approaching here, and he forces the owners and the miners to sit down to arbitration, which will win the miners more money. It's the first time that a president takes the side of strikers. Remember Hayes in the 77 railroad strike. Remember Cleveland in the 94 Pullman strike, sending in the troops to bust up the strikers to get the railroads moving. It's not the side that Teddy takes here. The 1890 basis of trust busting, again, is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which, if you remember the E.C. Knight case, basically gutted this at the tail end of the 1800s by saying that many of these trusts are not really trusts. If you're using the argument that the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, which allows the regulation of trade between states. Well, E.C. Knight was this sugar company, had 98% control of the sugar production in the U.S., but they argued that they weren't a monopoly and that they weren't, not a monopoly, but they argued that the Interstate Commerce Clause did not apply to them because they were producers, not transporters. So they got around this by this technicality. And Roosevelt, as I would say, pulls this out, he dusts it off, he uses it as the weapon that it was intended to be used against trust. The Elkins Act is a law under Roosevelt that bans railroad rebates. The Hepburn Act will limit railroad rates, will give power to the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to limit railroad rates. The Keating-Owen Act bans child labor. John Muir is the creator of the Sierra Club. He is an advocate of land set-asides, a friend of Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt is going to set aside the first national parks and forests. Limits of progressivism on some topics here. Various questions that the AP has asked you to talk about is how did progressivism influence politics, urban conditions, the workplace, labor, conservation. Just some thoughts on this. As far as politics go, you should know the 4 progressive amendments. They all take place under Woodrow Wilson, who is the third of the progressive presidents. 16th Amendment is the income tax, which is supposedly only on the wealthy at this time. 17th Amendment is the direct election of U.S. senators. Now remember, before this, it was state legislatures picked the U.S. senators. 18th Amendment is prohibition. What does this have to do with reform? Well, it is considered to be a moral reform. And this is, a lot of the momentum is happening during World War I, so this is sort of a slap at German Americans. It's a slap at drunkenness. It's a blow for supporting the family against drunken men, but it's also anti-immigration. Remember, this is a period where all these millions of immigrants are coming from Southern Europe, and the feeling is that the slums, the crime, the prostitution, whatever you want to, all these problems on the East Coast are being caused by Jewish and Catholic and Eastern European, Southern European immigrants, and this is sort of indirectly a slap against them. The 18th Amendment is seen as being something that is bringing moral progress. The 19th Amendment allows women to vote. As far as urban working conditions, a lot of progressivism is on the municipal, city, state level. Things such as housing codes, building codes, safety codes, health codes, paving of streets, public lighting, municipal socialism, which is the local control of the water supply and electrical production and sewer systems. The workplace on the state level, remember the Wisconsin experiment, or Wisconsin as a laboratory. Remember Robert the progressive governor of Wisconsin introduces on a state level regulation of railroads and workers' compensation. You have child labor laws, you have minimum and maximum wages for women and maximum working hours at the state level. As far as labor goes, you could point to the anthracite coal strike with the president threatening intervention in the mine, sending in troops, and forcing this arbitration. You have the use of the Sherman Antitrust Act against industry, but not against labor. In fact, the Clayton Antitrust Act specifically excludes labor unions as a target of antitrust acts. Conservation, again, you can point to Teddy Roosevelt and national parks and forest set-asides here. Wilson's New Freedom, his plan when he runs in 1912 and he wins, he's got 3 goals, and that's to go after the banks, to go after the tariff, and to go after the trusts. And you get the Federal Reserve Act setting up an independent bank. This is really an economic explanation here, but we won't get into the details. But the Federal Reserve Act sets up this super bank, this government bank where banks set aside, there's a reserve requirement which allows sort of this pool for the Fed to release money into the economy or to pull it out to fight either inflation or unemployment. The tariffs are lowered under the Underwood tariff, and the Clayton Antitrust Act is a stronger antitrust act with more teeth than the original Sherman Act. Progressivism and race, well, the short of it is African Americans are ignored. Lynching, Jim Crow, segregation are all alive and well in the South. There's not a lot of interest in sticking one's neck out politically on the sake of black Americans. The Gifford Pinchot, Richard Ballinger controversy, just the Pinchot Ballinger controversy under Taft. Taft was Taft's appointee, Richard Ballinger, to the Department of the Interior, was a less ardent conservationist, and he opened federal lands that had been set aside to development, to loggers and to oil and to mining. And this was one of the reasons why Teddy Roosevelt, after stepping down, got mad at Taft and ran against him in 1912 as not being progressive enough. How is progressivism arguably a conservative movement? Well, the goal here is to regulate industry. It's not to break it up. It's not socialism. You don't have the takeover of railroads and mines and industry. And progressivism accepts urbanity, accepts urban growth and industrial growth. It accepts this as something to stay. And capitalism, it thrives under progressivism. Workers get a little bit more of a fair share as there's some growth in unionism. You have the first minimum wages and maximum working hours at the state level here, but largely this is not anything that's threatening business or capitalism. It's conservative. It's conserving tradition. The three progressive presidents are Teddy Roosevelt. After the assassination of McKinley in 1901, he completes the first term of McKinley. Then he runs again in 1904, and then Taft wins in 1908. And in 1912, Woodrow Wilson will win the election of 1912. And one thing to note, this election is interesting in that you have four essentially progressive candidates. Woodrow Wilson, who runs, he's the progressive governor of New Jersey. He is a Democrat. He is a progressive. He's a member of the New Freedom. He's after the banks, the tariffs, and the trusts, and he goes after them, and he has these four amendments: the income tax, the direct election of senators, prohibition, and the voting for women, all pass as president. He's running against Taft, who's maybe the most conservative of the four, but Taft breaks up more trusts than Teddy Roosevelt did. He's a former lawyer. He's very much more of a legalist than Roosevelt. So Taft is no slouch. He is a progressive. And Teddy Roosevelt is angry because Taft is not progressive enough. And Teddy is this bull moose, the bull moose party. And then you have Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party, which gets close to 1 million votes. And socialism is a government takeover of industry, or the what are called the means of production. So, also who won and why. The Republicans split. Taft gets the renomination for the Republicans, but Teddy Roosevelt pulls out away votes when he breaks off the more progressive Republicans from the Republican Party, throwing it to the Democrats, Woodrow Wilson. So there's some stuff to know here for the test that's coming up. So hang in there, study early, know what's on here, and you'll see it again. Signing out.